I'm not certain that this story belongs in the sub, but involves a story that does involve a level of stalking. I figure I would post it here. To gain a proper context of this story, I should explain some things about the town that I grew up in. I lived and still live in one of the wealthier countries in the United States. You have two towns that fall in the low middle class bracket, with the majority being middle to upper middle class. I lived in one of those towns. At the time of this story, 1995 or 96, the majority of the town was white, with a very few Hispanic and Asian families. Seeing as I'm a minority, I used to be teased and bullied due to the color of my skin. As it was a suburban neighborhood, it was never beyond racial slurs or light bullying though. On to the story. The town has 5 schools, not including the Catholic school. There are 2 that cater to the pre-K to 5th grade crowd, while the other 2 go from pre-K to 8th grade, one of each type in the north and south side of town, with a high school that takes in children from north and south sides respectively. I was attending the pre-K to 5th on the north side of town. I had never heard much about a particular teacher until when it was getting close to when I was entering the 5th grade. Apparently, everybody wanted to be in his class. His name was John. He had been teaching at the school for a number of years. His family participated in many town events, and he was the coach for the high school baseball and softball teams for a number of years after this incident occurred. Parents loved him so much that they would push for their child to attend his class. It did not work that way. You were assigned to a teacher by alphabetical order, not preference. For the first month or so, I could see why everybody loved him. He taught in a way that was quirky but practical. He liked the children to engage in their studies rather than feel the need to cram it in before dismissing it. He had a passion for every lesson he taught. Keep in mind that for primary school, the teacher would cover all topics from mathematics to English to history. He loved to joke around and get his students laughing whenever possible. That's what led to the beginning of when things began to go sour. One day, he had told a particularly funny joke. Everyone in the class began laughing. One by one, the kids began to quiet down until one student, AJ, was the only one left laughing. To this day, I do not know the motivation behind it, but when AJ could not calm himself down, John walked behind him and in a swift movement, grabbed the back of his head, slammed it twice against his desk before pulling it back up. AJ sort of toppled over and fell to the ground. Everyone in the classroom was silent. John then began to semi-kick/sweep AJ out of the classroom. His desk was the second one from the door, until he was in the hallway, and then, as though nothing happened, he continued going on with his lesson. The next day, AJ was absent. We had a substitute teacher, and all the students were being called down to the principal's office. When I was called to the principal's office, there was the principal, and then there was a police officer there too, who I recognized from the DARE program. And then there was a man and a woman in suits. I later concluded that it was CPS. They wanted to know what happened yesterday in class. I told them what I had seen, and then I was sent back up to class. 2 days later, AJ was still absent, but John was back to teaching. I need to really stress that John and his family were very connected and well liked throughout the town. I say this because, though this happened almost 20 years ago, I cannot understand how he was allowed to keep his job. He knew that I had told the truth. From then on out, the abuse began lightly. The first thing John would do is begin volunteering me to answer any questions and all questions he had while teaching. It made no difference if other children raised their hands when he asked a question. He would always call on me. I was always shy and never liked to stand out in the crowd. And the more he did this, the more I became nervous as whether I did or didn't know the answer. He would chuckle and say things like, "Of course you don't know," or "I don't expect much of you." After a few weeks, I began receiving detention for others misbehaving. If kids were caught talking or passing notes, it was my fault, even if I was sitting across the room. The first thing he did, since I was a quote, absolutely such a troublemaker, was pick up my desk. It was a desk with a chair attached to it, along with me in it, and move it to the back of the room near the closets. As I was adopted, it was well known in my town, as I made a speech in 4th grade about how I was adopted and proud to be an American. The next step was having me face the wall, as only true Americans should be able to learn. One particular incident that I will never forget is when a classmate had made a paper plane and thrown it across the room. When John saw that, I had detention for the afternoon. I had detention almost every afternoon for the rest of the year. When everyone else had left for his assignment, I had to stay back and write a 500-word essay on history. Keep in mind, I had no books. We were not learning what he was trying to tell me to write an essay about in social studies, and I was 10 years old. I was sitting in the classroom until 4:30 when I finally stood up. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, standing up to match my movements. "I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore, and my mom is waiting for me outside." I lived about 6 blocks from the school, but I was hoping he would think that I had a concerned parent outside and he would let me leave. When I saw that he didn't believe that, I dashed for the door without my books or book bag and bolted down the stairs until I hit the first floor. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I was cut short as I heard the second floor stairway door slam open and then his footsteps rushing down the stairs. I bolted out of the back doors and did not stop running until I was down the block from my house. At the time, both my parents were working. My mom would normally get home around 3 or 4, whereas my dad would get home until 6 to 9 at night. My mom initially thought that I was saying these things about my teacher because I wanted attention, but when it started to become common for me to come home and crawl into the fetal position as I cried for a couple hours, she began to do some investigating. Before I knew it, my mom was at the school after hours almost every day fighting for justice, or to have me placed in another classroom. Much later in my life, I heard that my mom had a meeting with the principal and John. She explained what I had told her that had been happening. John's response to her was, "I don't really see what I'm doing wrong here," with a smug grin on his face. The principal believed me and my mom and was willing to fight for me. This is why I say that I wanted to stress that him and his family had leverage in my town. The day the principal promised us that he would begin investigating into the matter, the Board of Education made him an offer. In exchange for dropping any investigation, they would promote him to superintendent. Immediately, he was gone and a substitute principal was put in place, who I also had later as a substitute teacher in the 7th grade. I would think that he was told that he was there until a replacement principal could be found. No investigations were ever launched, and any further complaints to the temporary principal were met with, quote, "My hands are too tied, and there's nothing we can do." This story can continue for a while, but I'll focus on what happened as a form of retaliation for getting my mother involved. One day, right before recess, John told my classmates, while I was in the room, that I was not a true American, and people like me needed to learn my place. He suggested that they do what they felt they should do to make me feel welcomed on the playground, and to spread the word to the other kids in the other classes. The first day I went outside to play for lunch, I had 2 kids double team on me. I was bullied relentlessly. If I even tried to take a swing at another kid who was standing around, they would push me so that I would lose my balance. Since John had taken the volunteer role of watching over the kids during recess and lunchtime, no one came to my aid. For the rest of the school year, I was eating my lunch and spending my recess and lunch periods inside the stairwell with my niece and a few of the special education kids to keep me company. By the end of the school year, I had gotten used to sitting outside of the classroom for portions of the class. My troublemaking was bad enough, where sitting in the back turned away from everybody else wasn't effective anymore. Detentions were common, and my mother was in the office almost every day. What I was afraid of most was that everyone from my class would be transferred over to North Pre-K to 8th grade school, and since most of them had taken to beating up on me on and off the playground, I feared that this would continue. I did not know what had to be done, but I was ordered to seek child psychology, and there was an exception granted so I could go to the counterpart school on the southern side of town. I've relayed this story, and I know that it sounds far-fetched and completely made up. After all, how could someone get away with all this without any repercussions? To be honest, I don't have all the answers. I discovered later on that, besides AJ, whose parents began at-home teaching from then on out, I was the only one who had told the truth about what happened. Later on, kids admitted that their parents had told them to lie if they were ever asked about what took place. When you have a teacher with a solid track record who is a pillar in the local community and donates money and resources to the town versus the word of 2 10-year-olds, I guess it was not enough to hold it against him. I spoke to the old principal when I hit adulthood about the entire ordeal, and he admitted that John had connections with the police and CPS. It was how he found out I had said anything, and though he hated to admit it, the principal had been bribed to keep his mouth shut and move on. I told him that I held nothing against him and still speak to him on a rare occasion. I can't say John is a defining person in my life. He changed how I saw the world, people, and the issues caused from that ordeal left me with issues that I still deal with today. Even when I was 17, I would still have people who would throw food, drinks, and once a rock at me, because it was what they had been told to do by teachers 7 years earlier. All I can do is make sure that my nieces and nephew never have to deal with him, and try to move on the best that I can. The last thing I heard of him was that he still coaches baseball and softball and still teaches. He still lives in the same house he lived in when I had him as a teacher, though I have seen him around town. I have never once spoken to him since 5th grade, and one time, where we were close enough to each other that he could recognize me, I do not believe he knew who I was. That's my story of the worst bully I ever had. Not at the hands of a student, but from a teacher. I apologize if it does not belong in this sub. If it should be posted somewhere else, please be kind and point me towards where it should be posted. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I will try to answer what I can. If I'm unclear about anything particular, I'm very sorry. I'm writing this while I'm very tired, and I'm recalling an event that took place almost 20 years ago. Edit. Thank you for all those who have expressed kind words and warm wishes. When I posted this, I did not expect the story to get the amount of attention that it did, and it means a lot that so many of you agree that what took place was wrong. I especially did not expect for people to become so angry at John, that they had been requesting his information. If you read my responses, you will see that I am hesitant in releasing said information. To those who feel as though I should take action against him, please understand that what you are advising or suggesting is illegal. As I have no intent or desire to go to jail or commit a greater act of violence, I will not entertain any suggestions of doing so. So please guys, can we keep the "you need to kill him" comments to a minimum? So while I was reading all of these stories here, I remembered one of my own. I want to state beforehand that English is my second language, so I will come back to edit anything wrong with my grammar. I live in South America, and at the time I was 5 to 6 years old, and my family lived in a little house. The first one that my father ever bought. This house was situated in a very populated neighborhood. People living there didn't have a high income, but they were really nice and warm people. We knew almost everyone on our street, and me and my brother used to play outside until late at night with no trouble at all, except for me. There was a kid that lived a few houses from ours that was my own little bully. He was around my age, and I remember him distinctly because he had a really noticeable feature. Quite a few now that I think of it. He had lots of freckles and bright red-orange hair. I never really knew his parents, and they weren't really sociable, so the rest of the parents didn't really know about them either. When this kid was in the streets, it was my worst nightmare. He used to pull my hair, manhandle me. Note, I've always been a really small and fragile girl, pinch my face and arms, and he always laughed while he was doing all of these things, even when I seemed extremely annoyed and scared. He scared me to the point that when I was out and saw him getting near me, I ran towards my house, which had a tall fence, and just stayed inside for the whole day. Looking back, I think there was something wrong with this boy, because he never talked, not a word. When I ran and closed the fence, which you could see through, he would stay there trying to get through it, throwing his arms inside and trying to stick his head in. He just creeped me out to no end. The tormenting stopped a little after my brother hit him once, because he was honestly getting too violent towards me. We finally moved from that old neighborhood when I was around 7 years old. Fast forward a few years later, I was 10 years old, and I had long forgotten about this situation. I had accompanied my mom to do some errands. She had to quickly deliver something to a friend's house, so we went in the car. She parked the car across the street from her friend's house and told me it would be a few minutes, so she left me in the passenger seat with the window slightly cracked. She crossed the street and ringed her friend, and they just stayed there talking in the doorway. While I was waiting, I saw 3 boys walking towards the car, and I instantly felt like my stomach was turning upside down. He grew up, but I could still recognize him, even after 5 years. He looked at the car and caught me looking at him. He instantly put a serious face on and started walking faster towards the car. At this moment, I was just completely frozen. I wanted to yell for my mom, but she was across the street and wouldn't hear me yelling. Suddenly, he was out of my window. I kept looking straight, but I could feel him just staring at me. He didn't say a thing. Then he proceeded to try to open the door, which luckily was locked. Just when I felt a bit safer, he starts getting his head really close to the window like he was looking for something inside the car. I didn't get what he was trying to do. I mean, he couldn't enter through it anyways, so I just kind of stayed there waiting for it to be over. But just when I got what he had been looking for, he found it. He finally spotted the lock. Unfortunately, my car at the time had a lock just at the base of the window. He then gave me a big smile while looking at me dead in the eye. A big fucking terrifying smile, and he slowly started to get his arm through the window, obviously going for the locker. Now, I was pretty terrified and just wanted to get the fuck out of there, and that's just what I did. In one daring move, I got to the driver's seat, unlocked the doors, and got out running, crossed the street without even looking, because fuck it, and then got to my mom, crying and shaking. When I looked back, he had the door open and was still staring at me smiling. My mother just screamed at him and told him to close the fucking door and leave, which he did, and just like that, it was all over. It's been more than 10 years since that happened, and I'm still trying to figure out what was wrong with him. Though I'm not anticipating another encounter. Creepy bully from my childhood, let's not meet again. So, back when I was around 6 or 7, I had a childhood bully. No shit, right? Everybody had some little prick who picked on them growing up. What makes him so different? Well, for several years, I had the same sentiment. That is until I gained information about him, his family, and his history that made things much more terrifying looking back. There are 3 main events with him that shed plenty of light into who he is. My first memory with this kid is him cornering me on the playground and preventing me from leaving. The whole time I was pleading with him to just let me go home, mostly because I knew I couldn't fight him, as he was like a year or 2 older than me, and twice my size. Now, this isn't too alarming, especially as I was able to slip by him and run back home. But it was odd that he would go after me, because, not to brag, but I was a very nice kid at the time, and I had a lot of friends. Which brings up the other oddity. I hung around people who were pretty tough and were part of the older kids, and since this was a small town, everybody knew everybody, so this would be odd he would go after me since he must have known the people I was usually around. Now, the second event is much more alarming, especially since I don't even remember it. I only know it because my sister told me years after the fact. She told me at my bus stop. I was waiting to get on the bus, and she looked out the window only a couple of minutes after the fact. She saw me being choked by this kid, and she managed to scare him off. What really scares me is that I have no memory of it whatsoever, so I think he was choking me so hard that the oxygen couldn't reach my brain, which caused the memory loss. Which means, if she hadn't scared him off, I don't know what would have happened to me. But the third event is what truly gets me to this day. I was getting ready to head out and meet with my friends. Just as I was about to head out to the back door of my porch, my heart drops. I see him walking around my porch to the side of my house. I immediately closed the door and locked it. I was shitting bricks at this point as I'm heading to my room, hoping he would just forget about me and leave. My other older sister told me something that I'll never forget. Hey, is that kid your friend? He's been walking around the house for like the past 20 minutes. I had felt a giant pit in my stomach after I heard this, and now I knew he wasn't going to leave me alone. I told my sister to get him away and that he was bullying me. She did just that, and I never saw him around my house again. He was still a prick to me for a few years after the fact, but it never reached that level of disturbing again. I never saw him again after he and his brother were taken by child services. I didn't know what their parents did, but it must have been something terrible, since no one will tell me 12 years after the fact. What I do know is that their weird behavior was definitely inherited from their home life, which for the younger brother got way worse after the fact as he tried and failed to molest somebody who's a young relative of mine, and that the older one's weird behavior, like pulling down his pants to show his ass, not out in a fuck you kind of display, more like he thought everybody wanted to see his ass. This is kind of when the gears started to turn in my head. I began to ask myself, what the hell was he going to do to me? I still don't have an answer. Honestly, this is what gets me. I always went out for several hours to play with friends, so would my family notice until it was too late? He already showed a violent streak, and if he was anything like his brother, he would have done something to me. What if I hadn't noticed him, and he got me before I would have the chance to escape? There's some woods behind my house, so there was a potential hiding space. All of this has circled through my thoughts for 3 months now, and I felt I needed to get it off my chest. All I can say now is that I hope they got some help, but I hope we never do meet again.